Welcome. So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out. I'm Brian Michael Tracy. I'm your host this evening. And this is maybe our 15th storyteller since we started. Tonight we have a really special feature we're very excited about, and I want to thank Kim for really helping to organize this. Many of you may remember Kim from, I think it was just a year ago. I think it was November of last year that Kim read her material. Wonderful. As most of you know, Kim is a terrifically talented writer in her own right. And would love to have you back again sometime. We can find a date, I'm sure. And so just a few notes. Tonight we're going to have 2 student readers, and then we're going to have Aja come up and read. Are you going to read from your new novel, The Ensemble? Terrific. And then after that, for all of you students out there and others, there's always an open mic. So afterwards, so that's always part of the storyteller. So, if you have something you'd like to share, whether it's yours or something that you really enjoy, something that's moved you, you come up and take your 5 minutes of fame and imbibe in the open mic, okay? So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kim and let her make the introductions.
Thanks everybody for coming. We're very excited to be here tonight, and thank you to Brian and Idlewild Storytellers for collaborating with us on this reading. Aja has been here for the last 2 days working with the Idlewild Arts creative writing students, workshopping and teaching a master class, and we were really excited to pair up with Idlewild Storytellers and have her come give this reading in town. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So we have 2 student readers before Aja who are going to come up and read. Our first reader is going to be Bella Koschak. And Bella is a sophomore creative writing major at Idlewild Arts. She is originally from Baltimore. And though she is only 15, she's already been getting her work out there in the world. So she's had her work published in Sonder Midwest and Cut Bank Literary Magazine. And I have to brag on her a little bit for Cut Bank, because that's a really big deal. It's a magazine that's difficult. It's not a high school magazine. It's a magazine that's difficult for adults to get their work published in. So that was a pretty big deal. Yeah. She's been recognized by the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and she's attended the Juniper Institute for Young Writers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's also poetry editor on campus for our literary journal, Parallax. So please welcome Bella.
I'm going to be reading a piece called The Swedish Fishmonger. It's a short story I wrote. So I was raised by my mother, my grandmother, and my step-grandfather who suffers from Alzheimer's. In this household, there wasn't really a religious structure, and most of what the people who were raising me told me about spirituality was actually derived from their own imaginations, especially my grandfather. A lot of his were just very story-like things about how the world works. And yeah, this is kind of my take on that. Yeah. Before Robert McGrath was Robert McGrath, or Mr. McGrath, or excuse me, sir, he had been Robbie. Robbie from the small house at the end of the road with the swing set and tomato plants. Robbie with his bugs and turtle shells, Robbie with grass stains, skin, knees, dirt under his fingernails. He had been Robbie, come in for dinner. He had been Robbie, clapping erasers and coughing at the chalky air at the edge of the blacktop after school. When Robert McGrath had been Robbie, his uncle took him to a model train museum. Each glass case was a bird's eye view of tiny train travel through the centuries. The train cars were the size of a Snickers bar, and the tiny, faceless people were waiting for it to come out of the papier-mâché tunnel. The Greenbelt nursing home tried so hard to be a well-oiled microcosm of society. Its residents, rubbing wrinkle cream under their eyes and throwing away eggshells, did everything in their handy capabilities to replicate what they remembered from the offices and supermarkets and public transportation systems that lay outside the walls. In the very same way that children play inside what they believe to be an adult realm, the residents of the Greenbelt nursing home recreated the shards that their slowing minds still recalled. Betsy Summerall, who had grown up in a town that re-elected a golden retriever as mayor 17 times, took the position of dictator of their small universe. When originally organizing their governing system, Pat Gordon, an ex-eye doctor and an ex-2020 vision man, suggested, why not make it an oligarchy? Seems fair, seems more American than a dictator. Olives? Will there be olives? The rest of the council chimed in at the suggestion of their favorite with cheese snack. No olives, oligarchy. Down with the patriarchy, cried a woman who couldn't really hear, but could definitely tell you about 1920. That's right, Betsy catered to this glowing blessing, this lack of hearing aids. He wants a patriarchy. Down with the patriarchy. That's right, down with it. I will be the leader, a woman once and for all, Betsy said. She said it slow and loud, each syllable like ironing her husband's coarse white button-ups. She was met with a gummy choir of agreement. At the train station museum, there was a concession stand run by a young man wearing a white and red striped cap and bow tie. Robbie bought a box of Swedish fish for $0.25. He sunk his front teeth into one and held it there as he walked through the exhibits. He swallowed his fish in a flush of red-flavored excitement. Uncle Mike, to these people, a Swedish fish would be like a red whale. Imagine a giant red whale falling from the sky. His teeth were a little tinted, a soft red toothy smile. Under his breath, a giant red whale. Uncle Mike, a new idea waiting like unpopped popcorn. His uncle looked down a little wearily. He was just trying to help his sister. He hadn't expected to have to talk to his nephew. What if all the people waited for a big red whale to swim them from place to place instead of a train? That would be nice. Mike, with better things to do, refocused his attention on model steam engines and strolled along the glass cases in his adult museum-goer walk. Robbie's idea became a kernel stuck on an unreachable part of his esophagus. Shelley, who loved hard-boiled eggs, potted plants, and fountains, took the high-staked position of head of the Department of Transportation at the Greenbelt nursing home. There was no real form of transportation within the home, so she took it upon herself to push wheelchairs, assist in the assembly of metal walkers, and stand at the intersection of halls during brunch time yelling, "Slow!" at her fellow seniors and directing them in a series of miscalculated hand gestures. Name for the books, requested Ginger Mason, ex-librarian, current historian, and interminable lover of hairless cats. Shelley. Full name. It's just Shelley. What about your last name? Prompted Queen Betsy. They took it. Who did? Shelley lowered herself nearer to the ground, whispered, "The government." Robbie had been, just that moment, promoted to his birth certificate name, awash in his father's spewing anger. "Robert, we are an accounting family. Me and your grandfather and all the great-grandfathers before that, all accountants. And what are you telling me? That you want to jump into the ocean and have a look at some stinkin' whales?" "No." "Well, yes. Well, no. Marine biology. I want to study marine biology. So I can study whales and fish and things, but mostly whales because I like them the most. I mean, they're really quite fat. I will not pay thousands of dollars for any son of mine to make friends with fish. Whales are technically I don't care. You are going to study accounting? It's a good, decent, family-supporting trade." They were at the kitchen table, eating lentils. So it goes, dreams spoiled over legumes. Slowly, their little world organized itself. Under stairwells between bookshelves next to the vending machine, makeshift shops popped up. Ethel Crimson sold very personal trinkets, her mother's thimbles, a book of recipes, letters and postcards, and the stubs of her high school pencils. Ethel, won't you miss these things once they run out? Asked Betsy. They don't run out. Richard Lorne was, from the moment he dropped out of Princeton, a licenseless taxidermist. He sold the dried corpses of crickets and ladybugs. His high-stakes wares were the stuffed rats that he had captured near the faux pond across from the home. Sarah Higgins, desperate to be a small business owner also, attempted to sell her dentures. Betsy shut that down pretty quick. An acting troupe formed itself, led by an ex-Broadway Scottish accent coach. They put on original musicals, all of which involved Cornelius O'Connor dressing up as a woman and talking in a high Scottish accented falsetto. All the plays were attended by the masses. All the plays received a standing ovation. All the plays were the topic of brunch conversation for weeks to follow. Robbie, 12 now, was called Robert when he was in trouble. Went to an all-boys Catholic school, knelt on his knees, which became so bruised they remained a permanent shade of green, blue, purple. He said prayers and songs and flicked spit at the back of another boy's uniform. Rows and rows of boys with folded hands and unchanging voices, repeating words and words and repeating words and repeating. Robbie imagined a whale, a big red Swedish fish whale, a mass of sweet, thick jelly, crashing through the chapel ceiling. Robbie, 12 and chap-lipped, named this whale God. Betsy came to Robert as their geriatric world formed itself. He was soft-spoken. He wore pastels and a bow tie, combed his hair back every day. He read Roald Dahl every night. His bedroom walls were plastered with pictures of whales. And Robert, what have you decided to do in our new community? What role will you play? Robert's eyes looked like light hanging in front of a city center bakery. Can I make our religion? So Robert became the Pope of sorts, educating and leading the Greenbelt nursing home residents in a new religion, a religion in which they swam through the sweet waters of life until a giant Swedish fish came crashing through the ceiling to take them. In lieu of communion wafers, he gave each of them a single Swedish fish. Every Tuesday evening, they gathered near the faux pond. They talked of the great whale. They called it God. Robert told stories. He made them up on the spot. They were supposed to teach lessons, but they were all just red-flavored and enthralling. It was an apple slice, rippling skin, cold toes kind of night. Robbie was 17. Robbie, toes blue and dipped in a real pond, sat thigh to bare thigh with Sam. Sam was 18 and he was going to leave in a year. He was going far away, he said. Far as in far. Robbie and Sam talked in soft, leafy voices. In voices that were reserved for Sam and Robbie alone. The sky was purple with runny red skid marks. Sam and Robbie braided their fingers together, Robbie's head on Sam's shoulder. They talked about lovely things like whales and home-pierced ears and cattails and bubblegum bubbles. You wish for movie moments. They kissed and it tasted red. They kissed and the whole world got goose skin, got shivers. They kissed, soft, overripe kiss, first kiss, love kiss in the woods, out of sight kiss. Sometimes you get movie moments. Robert sat with the fears that eddied in and out of his mind of the other residents of the Greenbelt nursing home. It wasn't talked about, but death was coming. A toy train around the corner, a ceiling caving in. They could smell the sweet red whale weighing it down. Robert sat with that wide-stretched truth, held its hand, clinked his glass with it. What's your title? In the church, I mean, asked Ethel as Robert gave them each a Swedish fish. I'm just a mere Swedish fishmonger. Swedish fishmonger for our souls, exclaimed Shelley. She loved Swedish fish, but not as much as hard-boiled eggs. When the rumors spread like maggots in bread, Robbie, now Robert, was asked to leave. All of it. 17 and long-fingered, he gripped his backpack straps. At school, they tried not to hold hands, not to make eye contact, not to talk in their Sam and Robbie alone voices. They tried to keep their voices deep, their uniforms pressed. Robert found it too hard. His world folded and folded and folded until he could shoot it through a straw like a spitball. Tried to unfold it on the dining room table in front of his father, half listening as he read the paper. Only after it was fully unfolded on the table did Robert's father hear what was being said. Words were yelled and bags were packed, and Robbie was now Robert. Robert saw his ceiling caving in, a red sweetness leaking slowly through the cracks. He was okay with it. He had known love. He had swaddled himself in it. Lying in his bed, he was surrounded by the other members of the Swedish Fish Church, by the members of the Greenbelt nursing home world. His face wrinkles crinkled softly, a warmth tucked under each fold. He knew he was close. He told everyone so. He told them and he loved them. He could see his Swedish fish whale very clearly now, lowering towards him with a lovely, gummy smile. He smiled back up at it. It tastes red. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. That was fantastic. And this is going to be Bailey Bunoshek. Bailey is a senior creative writing major at Idlewild Arts, and she has bylines with Girls Life, which I believe she interned for this summer and wrote several articles for, and the Adroit Journal, which again, this is a professional journal that's difficult to get your work into. Her work has also been nationally recognized by the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. She won a gold medal for a short story and was invited to Carnegie Hall to accept her award, and as well as some other recognitions from Scholastic. And she is fiction editor for Parallax Literary Journal. Please come on up, Bailey.
I think so. Yeah, thanks. I'm Bailey, and I'm gonna be reading, I wouldn't call it science fiction, but it's kind of like inspired by the Twilight Zone, so it's like a weird story. And it's called A Minute Behind. The most nervous passenger on the plane was the one that hadn't brought a vomit bag. He admitted to his neighbor that he'd expected the plane to provide them. The neighbor, tall but not slender, tired but not sleepy, nodded along. They used to give you a full-course meal, she said. Didn't even have to pay extra for it. And a paper bag, the nervous passenger said, happy to find someone agreeing with him. It cost maybe 10 cents. Depends on where you buy. Yes, he said, that's true. The woman had hair down to her elbows, black, something foreboding about it. Maybe it had gone too long without being washed. The nervous passenger, Peter, had an urge to touch it, ever so gently, but he knew he'd hold on too long and get caught. The thought occurred during a bout of especially terrifying turbulence that if he garnered sympathy from the woman, by relating his condition perhaps, she would allow him to touch her hair, and he would get the chance to get something off his chest. A win-win. Peter looked over at the woman and wondered where to start. She was wide awake and looked politely back at him, waiting. Finally, he said, I have a rare condition. What? It was a strange way to start. Maybe too out there, and he'd scared her off, and it was all his fault. He continued talking before the embarrassment hit him, focusing on the deep purple hue of the woman's dress. It had little ducks on it. Say we were going to fall out of the sky right now, and everyone caught on fire. I would be on fire, but I wouldn't feel it. Not for 30 seconds or so. Then it would hit me. His seatmate was horrified. He could see her throat tighten. Her mouth became still like she was choking. She scratched her neck and turned away from him, not knowing what to say and unable physically to respond. It's called delayed response syndrome, he said quietly. A flight attendant walked by, and the woman waved her away absently, not lifting her eyes from the closed window shade. "I can prove it," Peter said. "It's not that I think you're lying," she said. "There has to be something wrong with you to suggest such a thing in the middle of a flight." The plane shook. "A little turbulence," someone across the aisle said. It was dry on the plane. Peter looked for the flight attendant down the aisle to flag her down for water, but she had disappeared behind the first-class curtain. "Hurt me," Peter said to his seat neighbor, it becoming apparent that there was no water around. He should have brought his own. "Are you allowed to bring water to the airport these days?" "Are you some kind of pervert?" the woman asked. "I'll report you, and you'll be kicked off the flight." "Just watch," Peter said, and he pressed one of his fingernails into his thumb until it was bleeding. It took him a short while to wince. "But you could be faking that," she said. The plane hit another rough patch, forcing the woman's shoulder into Peter's nose. His face remained serene, mildly hurt by her accusation, before he registered the pain and uttered a loud "ow." "I'm not lying," he said. The seatbelt sign flickered on and off, distracting people. The captain went to the intercom and told everyone, in case they didn't notice, they'd better stay in their seats. "I'm sorry," the woman said. Another jolt pushed her further to the side, colliding heads with him. He grabbed her hair as she pulled away. It slid through his fingers in the usual numb manner. Compulsion satisfied, the feeling was almost unpleasant when it came. His hands experienced roughness, sandpaper texture. How did hair get that way? What did she do to it? "Do you wish you had never been this way?" the woman asked Peter, the plane pausing its jolting long enough for conversation to resume around them. All the voices were quiet. She repeated her question. Peter had heard her the first time, was lost, was thinking. It was hard to be him sometimes. He was a slow eater. No one would eat with him more than once. He had to wait after each bite to make sure that it felt swallowed before he could get any more. And his conversation skills were weak because he felt like he had to explain his condition to everyone up front, lest they find out about it later and think that he was hiding something. But if someone put a gun to his head and made him admit it or die, he'd reveal that the curse was worth it to him for reasons unknown and best left unexplored. "I like the way I am," he answered her, garbled by a napkin thrust in his face by a flight attendant. "You're bleeding," the flight attendant said. He took the napkin and shooed her away. She tripped walking back down the aisle, landed flat on her face, the victim of another wild jolt, this one accompanied by the sensation of falling. "I don't want to die on this plane," the woman said to Peter. "I have children." "I have a daughter," Peter said, "a beautiful little girl. But I'm not allowed to see her. My ex won't let me. She won't even send me pictures." Oop. They were falling out of the sky, too slow to cause an immediate panic, but there was the dizziness of slow descent, like in an elevator. "If you've never seen pictures," the woman asked, "how do you know that your daughter is beautiful?" She thought no doubt that she'd caught him now. One lie and everything you say is tainted, the ears of your listener poisoned forever by the betrayal you committed once. "I was there when she was born," he explained in a rapture. The lights illuminating the aisle went out. Blind passengers struggled to open windows for spare moonlight. The black-haired woman was resting her head on the window shade and left it closed. "They even let me hold her," Peter said. The black-haired woman smiled like she had him all figured out. "When they took her out of your arms, I suppose you felt like you were still holding her?" The corners of Peter's mouth turned down. Even in the darkness, she could see the whites of his eyes narrow as he squinted. "Yes," he said. "Yes, for a moment. But then it was gone." The plane began to tremble like it was afraid of the sky, until finally the engines gave out. Down the plane fell, people exclaiming with each jolt, Peter feeling them after everyone else and messing up the rhythm of their pain. Oxygen masks fell, and the black-haired woman hit her head on the window shade. Peter sensed that she was gone as he put a mask on. The plane was headed for the ground. Peter would be the only one awake to see the impact, outlasting the others, hanging onto consciousness with a firm grip. Then a great gash was cut across his stomach by his belt buckle. He stared at it, waiting for the pain to come. But a merciful force swooped in, and the lack of oxygen got to him first. Finally, Peter had caught up with everyone else. Thank you.
Nice job, Bailey. Thank you. All right, and now it's time for our featured reader, Aja Gabel. Aja Gabel's debut novel, The Ensemble, is out from Riverhead Books. I have a few copies to sell, so if anybody would like to get a copy and get it signed tonight, just come see me after the reading, and I can take check, cash, or if you're a student, student ID. Her short fiction can be found in the Kenyon Review, Glimmer Train, Bomb, and elsewhere. She studied writing at Wesleyan University and the University of Virginia, and has a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. Aja has been the recipient of awards from Imprint, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. She currently lives and writes in Los Angeles. Please welcome Aja Gabel.
Thanks for coming out on this Saturday night. What a great turnout and place to hang out. This is my novel. It's called The Ensemble, and it's about a string quartet, which doesn't sound very rock and roll, but it is, I promise, because string quartets are weird in that you play with them often for decades, and you have to do it politely, but behind closed doors, it's not really that polite. So I had experience as a musician myself, which I can tell you about if you have questions afterwards, but just as a brief overview, I played cello for a long, long time. I started when I was 5. I played very competitively and nervously for a long time, and then decided to go to school for writing instead. But I never left classical music, and specifically chamber music and quartet playing behind. And so I really wanted to write a book about that, because it's a weird world that I feel like not a lot of people know about. And so I'm going to read from 2 sections here. The first section is the first 3 pages that just kind of introduces you to all 4 of these members of the quartet. And it goes between their perspectives, so there's not really one person to follow. And then when I read the second section, I'll tell you more about that. So this is May 1994, San Francisco. "It's a love story," the famous violinist had said, and even though Jana knew it was not, those were the words that knocked around her brain when she began to play on stage. The famous violinist, Fedorio, had coached the quartet earlier in the week, and it was what he'd said after they had finished a run-through of the Dvorak American, which, according to Jana, was definitely not a love story. But here they were, the Van Ness String Quartet, performing in their final graduation recital at the conservatory, starting the shimmering notes of the first movement, and all she could think, as much as thinking was involved at all, was maybe it was a love story. It was a love letter to the country, as she understood it from her classes, Dvorak's European peasant take on American folk songs. But how could someone think this was a story of romantic love? It seemed to Jana to be more classic than that. A person falls for a dream of a place, for a life that could be lived there, for something they were not but might be. It was about the shimmering itself, that almost visible stuff that hovered just above the hot pavement of your life. Potential, aspiration, accomplishment. The famous violinist who had coached them, Fedorio, she could not pronounce his name, was sort of a hack anyway, at least when it came to teaching. Jana would never tell him to his face, but she enjoyed the solemn, interior pleasure of her disdain. What did he know? Here's what she knew. that the Dvorak American was about the simple opportunity of America, and that no one was more closely acquainted with, identifying, and consuming opportunity than she was. By the time Henry's viola solo entered 3 bars later, she had decided again, no, it was not a love story. It's a love story was not something Henry remembered from the coaching session, and certainly not what was running through his mind when he introduced the jaunty melody in the 3rd bar. Instead, what had glommed on to the inside of Henry was what Fedorio had said when he passed Henry his card as he was packing up his viola. "Call me if you decide this quartet business isn't for you," he'd said. "I can set up a few recitals in front of the right people in New York. You could have a great solo career." Henry had wordlessly taken the card, slid it into the velvet pocket inside his case, and had not moved it since. But the card throbbed there nonetheless, "If you decide this quartet business isn't for you," as though Fedorio had already decided it was not for Henry and was simply waiting for Henry to come to the same conclusion. But Henry hadn't decided anything at all. He never did, young as he was and blessed with the kind of talent that guided life's decisions for him. Whether or not it was a love story did not concern Daniel, as these days he didn't have room in his life for romance or enduring love or any symptom or side effect of the two, not when he had to practice twice as hard to keep up with the rest of the quartet and their maddeningly natural abilities, and especially Henry, whose obscene talent teetered on the edge of prodigy, who could play drunk, blind, in love, or out of it. There was no space for love in Daniel's life when he had to work real jobs. In addition to their schooling, moonlighting at a bar in the Castro, picking up wedding gigs when he could, and teaching beginning cello lessons to rich kids in Pacific Heights. It's a love story, sure, okay, but what else? Of course it's a love story, thought Britt, though she thought everything was. This note here and this one, this joyful counter melody, her second violin harmony, the collective intangible, the audible agreement, her relationship with Daniel, which he'd rather coldly cut off a few days ago. Even the absence of love was a love story for her. Even this pain, this suffering, it was useful. Though she imagined one day no longer needing to know that. Or she fantasized about rewinding her life and starting over so she was a person who did not have to know that. Or she entertained the idea of a parallel Brit living in a world in which there was no need to make sense of a man who up and left on the brink of love, of people who up and left, of a life strung together with all these little leavings. But she felt sad for this parallel Brit, an emptier sadness than she felt for herself now. They were all love stories. And though no one would have explicitly admitted it, what it was about, love or something else, was entirely up to Jana. It depended on the way she took a quiet, sharp, and precisely timed breath in an upbeat before the first note, on the pressure of her attack on that first note, on the space she left between the first and the second notes, on the degree and length and resonance of the vibrato she applied to the violin neck. It was up to her minute movements, certainly in the beginning of the piece, if not after. Even the way she closed her eyes, if she closed them at all, if there was a flutter to her eyelashes, a stern set of her brow, all of that determined everything that was to follow. Jana's job as first violinist was to lead, but these days her leadership had expanded beyond the physical. Her bodily and tonal decisions, one after another, through an entire 45-minute program, now served as emotional leadership. The power in this was both benevolent and wicked, and to Jana felt perfectly natural. She had always wanted to truly lead a group, and better still, to lead a group to greatness. It had to happen. It would happen. Its future happening defined her. And where in this narrative of greatness was there room for a story of love? It wasn't any story she'd ever been told. So that's how the book opens. And I'm going to skip forward a couple years. The book skips forward a bunch of years because I didn't want to write the other stuff, so I just skipped to the stuff I wanted to write. So that's like you're introduced to them, and they're at conservatory. They're about to play this big concert that's going to make or break them. They spoiler alert, do not do well at that first concert. But they get a second chance. And they have to wait 4 years for it. So this is October 1998, and this competition's in Canada. And there's a few things you have to know. This is from the perspective of Henry. He's that violist I mentioned. He's really, really young. At this point, he is like early 20s. But at that point, he was in his teens. He's a prodigy. And when I was thinking about writing this book, I had read an article, I think it was in the New York Times, about prodigies, specifically classical music prodigies, and how child prodigies, and how when they grew up, almost statistically, a lot of them have mental and emotional breakdowns at like 20, 22, 23, because they've spent their whole childhood imitating these like grand stories through, whether it's opera or classical music, performance, or even like dance or acting, like theater. And so then when they get to the point where their internal psyche matches up to what they've been imitating their whole life, it's either too much or it's a letdown. It doesn't match up, and they often have these breakdowns. And so I thought, okay, I'm writing about this prodigy, and he's a member of this group, and he's better than the rest of them, and he always has the option to leave. They're all kind of messed up. He's got a good family. Like, what's the conflict here? And it seemed natural as I wrote more about this character that he would have this problem that he never got to choose what he did, right? You're a prodigy at the violin when you're 6. You don't grow up to become an accountant. You don't have a choice. You just become a violinist. And I think that must be hard when you become an adult to realize that you never got to choose it. It chose you. And so that's where Henry's at this point. They're at this competition. They have a second chance. He's gotten a drink with Daniel, the cellist. They got a little drunk. Daniel said something mean to him and then left. And so Henry's sort of wandering this hotel drunk. He's got a pregnant girlfriend at home, and there is a rival quartet. Told you there's a lot of juice in this book, but there's a rival quartet that is a French quartet, and they're called the St. Vincents, and the particularly annoying guy is called Laurent, and he shows up. I mean, you probably have to know a lot because, I don't know, and it's always boring when people try to explain how novels would happen, but anyway, if you were listening, you don't really need to know. Another thing I always like to say is that, when I was very little, I got to meet Yo-Yo Ma and play his cello and hang out with him. Not because I'm special, just because it happened. And he said that his son, who was my age, always fell asleep during his concerts. I think I was like 12 or something. And he said that's okay because being semi-conscious or unconscious even, is a great way to osmosis art and literature and music. And so if your mind wanders, it's okay. Don't fall asleep, but it's okay. This is all part of the experience. So, this is Henry. He felt as though he was underwater. The halls were too wide, he decided, stumbling down a corridor the full length of the hotel before realizing his room was a floor up. It was like something had come loose inside his head and was actually floating around, knocking against his skull, a dumb fish. He tried to remember if there was a mini bar in his room with snacks. What he needed was snacks. The halls were dark and old, and buried human noises pulsed through the closed doors. His room did not, in fact, have a fridge or even any crackers. And where had Daniel gone? He'd lost Daniel. Probably Daniel had lost him, or that's how Daniel would have likely explained it. When had they parted? He sat on his bed and held his hand up in front of his face. By the way, his hand hurts, which is really bad for a string instrument player. He held his hand up in front of his face. It didn't hurt anymore. He couldn't feel it at all, actually, but that was the same as not hurting. He examined the thin bones and ropey meat on his fingers, his knuckles automatically cascading down as if holding a bow aloft. He held his hand there so long that it seemed to detach from the rest of his body and become an idea of a hand, like a painting of a hand or a sculpture of a hand, even as he moved it front, back, front, back. This was Henry, his amazing hands, his incredible poise, his perfect pitch. Or it was Henry. But now, what is he now? Almost a father, an irritating boyfriend, an exiled friend, a deceitful quartet member. And still, no food. Food would fix everything. He didn't think of it as an excuse to knock on Jana's door. He really was starving, and he really had lost Daniel. He was hungry like he hadn't been in days, since he could remember, maybe. An ability to measure time was slipping away from him. He knocked again, not knowing how long it had been since he had last knocked, and then again, harder. He heard a scuffle behind the door, and a bar of light streamed from underneath onto his feet. The door opened like a wave crashing over him, but in reverse, pulling and pushing him at the same time. It was Laurent, as thick and well-boned as he remembered him. Something snobbish about his look, even though his hair was a mess, his shirt wrinkled under his sweater. "Henry," he said, infusing it with an accent, so it came out Henri. The entryway was lit up, but the rest of the room was shrouded in semi-darkness, and at the border where the light lost dimension stood Jana. She was perfectly still. "I was wondering if you had any cookies," Henry said. "What's wrong with that?" Jana said, pointing to his right hand, lobster red from the ice pack. He looked at his hand like it was new to him. Jana pulled him inside and went to the bathroom, where she rummaged through the drawers for a bandage. Then, like something Henry had dreamt into being, Daniel emerged. He'd been in this room the whole time. How long had it been since they'd left the bar? Henry gave up. There was no way to tell. And everyone here without him. "I didn't know where you'd gone," Daniel said, by way of explaining the strange collection of people in Jana's room. But Henry knew they'd been talking about him, his hand, the girl, the crying. Or was it worse to entertain the idea that they hadn't been talking about him? That perhaps they'd been talking about something unknown to him. Perhaps Jana and Daniel had been bonding over what they shared, something Henry could never share, the hard work it'd taken to get there, the trying and the wanting and the failing. Henry had never had to try, had never thought to want or not want, and was unacquainted with failure. Laurent casually leaned against the dresser. "Did you hurt it?" Henry searched for words. "I don't remember," he said. "I think it's just acting up because of the weather, or the longitude." "The altitude," Laurent said. "You don't have to be a jerk about it," Henry said. Laurent smiled, a smile like a sliver cut through his face. Jana was still wearing the same clothes she had been wearing on the plane, all black, but her face had the opened-up look of someone who'd just been kissing or laughing. She had an ace bandage in her hand. Laurent hovered around Henry like he was a potentially dangerous creature. Daniel stayed back. "Jesus," Jana said, "our first concert is tomorrow, and you tell me about your hand now? No, you didn't even tell me." "It feels temporary." "Tomorrow, Henry. Are you going to be okay by tomorrow?" "Hey, settle down. I just wanted some food," Henry said, looking to Daniel for sympathy and finding none. "It's going to be fine. It's easy. We'll play fine." "We have to play more than fine," Jana said. "Don't you understand? I thought you understood. You're drunk and injured. This matters." "You're the one with this oaf all night," Henry said, sweeping his good arm toward Laurent, catching a few fibers of Laurent's sweater on his fingertips. The light in the room seemed to dim. He could hear Daniel breathing. Laurent stepped forward. His mouth had a glint, the smile gone. "Maybe you should just go to sleep." "Oh, great," Henry said. His voice was coming out hysterical, shrill, taking tips from this piece of work. Laurent appeared to puff up, like a peacock Henry had seen once. Jana put her hands on her hips, angry now. This guy is probably here for sabotage purposes, Henry said. This guy's group needs it. Have you ever heard them play? This guy, their Mozart is... Henry, stop, Jana said, quiet and sad. It's downright embarrassing. Sounds like the Dissonance Quartet, but an accident. That's a music joke for you guys. This is ridiculous, Jana said and put her head in her hands. Just leave, Henry. Leave what? The room? The quartet? Don't be an asshole, Daniel said. Finally, Daniel stepping up to the plate, a feeling like a warm water balloon being punctured spread in Henry's chest. You want to talk about being an asshole? You, king of assholes? Which evidence should we bring in first? Lindsay or Britt? Me? Kimiko? Jana's the only one who's not mad at you, and that's because maybe you two are peas in a blanket. It's in a pod, Jana said. He turned back to her. They can't play for real, Jana. They're a novelty, something to look at, like French quadruplets. We don't have to be our best to beat them. Looking at Laurent straight on was like trying to discern people in the streets from a low-flying plane. There were the cars moving about, funny yellow cabs and robotic headlights, but where were the people? Laurent's absurd attractiveness momentarily amused Henry, though he still felt like crying. There wasn't much difference between the two emotions. He smiled. His eyes grew wet. Go ahead, Henry said to Laurent. Being a goon is the only thing you're really good at anyway. Laurent just stood there, shiny like a prize. But Daniel stepped forward. And what are you good at exactly? That's the problem, Henry said, smiling. I'm good at everything. Henry didn't even see Daniel's fist coming toward his cheekbone, but later he would understand the true measure of his own inebriation and think of the events that occurred between his knocking on the door and Daniel's punching him as chalk drawings on a blackboard that someone had leaned against and smudged out. The force of the blow was enough to knock Henry back onto the musk bedspread of one of the queen beds, arms akimbo, his face reeling long after he was down. The smile that had been there when Daniel punched him was skewed, in a different world now. As he lay there when the only thing he could see was the expanse of the ceiling above him, and the only thing he could hear was Jana's cursing, which was almost musical in its emotive content, Henry thought of three things in rapid succession. First, he thought of the coda that capped the first movement of the Shostakovich they'd play the following night. He used to love that piece. How it suddenly changed time signature and sped up, and everyone took a turn erratically sawing out the melody, and then they ended on this bizarre, optimistic, ascending run, gentle plucked notes for him, and Daniel and Jana and Britt on harmonics, like everything dissonant and off-kilter that had come before could be erased with these three pastoral notes. They always nailed that ending, but it always felt strange, like it could go off the rails at any moment. That's the way it was written. Second, he thought of Daniel's hand and how it would swell up if he didn't get ice immediately, and how Jana would blame him for that swelling. And third, he thought, with a bodily force that, had he tried to describe it, would sound synthetic or exaggerated, of how purely, ecstatically good it had felt being punched, how it had felt like a choice being punched, how it seemed to match with perfect equality the force that had been gnawing at him from the inside, how it sucked any pain he felt from his arm or his chest or his core or his imperfect heart and planted it in a welt on his cheekbone. He felt gratitude. He felt warmth all over his face, from blood or tears he didn't know and he didn't care. He was officially broken. Yeah, thanks. I think I'll end that there. I'm happy to answer a few questions if people have them. Could be about the book or...
So I guess part of I have a few, but one of the questions I have is, how closely did you draw on the characters as you knew them and as you lived through this experience, as you explained to us in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and how much of them were composites, if you will?
Yeah. Well, legally, everything is a coincidence in this book. But I had the great fortune to study with a quartet called the St. Lawrence String Quartet at Stanford when I was a kid for many summers, and they are still in residence there. They're incredible. They're the most incredible living quartet, I think. If you ever get a chance to see them play, you should. And playing with them and watching them interact as these people who had been together for years and years and years really affected the way that I thought about the dynamics of a string quartet. They're certainly not based on those people, but the dynamics of those relationships, I think, are some stuff that I've borrowed and grown with. There's a lot of similarities to other sort of situations, you know. I don't think that there's like a slimy famous violinist in here who's kind of gross, and that's also, as we now know, exists in the classical music world too, unfortunately, and I experienced that. And but mostly I think I drew on like the incredible weirdness of intense ambition that you have when you play classical music when you're young, or you do something like dance or theater, anything like that that's like requires performance. I think when you're a child, like it's something happens to your brain and the people that you play that you do that with, and that's certainly, I borrowed from that experience heavily to create these characters. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
What was the bridge between you being a musician and becoming a writer and writing about music?
The only things that I was good at or did when I was young was play music and write. I did both from the moment I could physically do them. I don't remember starting either of them. And they were very separate for a very long time. I didn't really write about music. And when it came time to decide if I was going to go to conservatory or college, I had to make that hard choice that I was going to go to a university because I was good, but I wasn't that next level good, and you could still have a career that way. It'd just be really hard. It'd be a life that was very hard. And so I decided to have the very easy life of a writer. I decided to go read books and study and see what became of that. And, you know, you can try to write and the failures aren't as public. And so that's what I did, but I kept playing music. I double majored in music. I kept playing in quartets. I played at every wedding in every city I was ever in. And then when I went to Provincetown to go write a book, was my plan, I used to take my cello with me on every plane ride, every place I moved. And that was the first place I did not take my cello. So it was the first time I moved somewhere and didn't have my instrument. And I didn't think of it as at the time, but now I think it's clear that that was a moment, and that me writing the novel about music was connected to this change that had left music behind, truly. Like, I wasn't a person who was going to play every day anymore. And now I was going to write a book, but in order to leave that behind, I kind of had to write about it. You know, it's not the only thing I'm interested in, but I had to do it yeah.
How do you know or assess that you are, in your view, not next level good? How do you, because it's not very subjective and very linked to time and places and...
Yes, but when you're 14 and you're competing a lot and you're not placing or you're not winning, it became clear that I was competing a lot and I wasn't winning, you know? And the people who applied to I don't know, the Colburn School or Eastman, a lot of my friends went to Eastman, all those people who go to Eastman won their competitions in their hometowns, you know, and or the regionals or whatever, and I just wasn't doing that. And in my private lessons, I could tell that I was like third on the list of the teacher students. That sounds so silly, but you know when you're a kid and you do things like that and you're at a certain level. But it took me longer to learn that my love of it didn't affect how good I was at it, technically. You know, like it's the same thing with ballet. Like my hands are very small. Like I just wasn't gonna ever be as good at cello as I had hoped. So I guess we're talking about different kinds of good, you know, like technically good, and then like there's a kind of good you are if you really love something too, which I was that good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Given the emotional import from all the descriptions from the characters, I mean, even to the fibers, the grace with the fingers, I mean, just such beautiful imagery.
Oh, thanks.
In such a technical field that is competitive or has this kind of performance-based impositions, do you find that it always has to be a negative impact for someone to re-recognize that the emotion of a particular piece of music? It seemed like the characters were describing love in the piece, but was it an abstract love? Were they so detached from it that it might be distanced in the way it comes out in the piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're just described like the problem that they have at the beginning, which is like, how can you play a love story without understanding what love is? And at that point in their lives, they don't really, it is abstract. So it is like you said, you know, you need both the technical skill and you need to understand the less tangible parts of art. And at the beginning of the book, they do not. So through the course of like 20 years, you watch them try to figure it out the way that we all are, even though they can do something superhuman, you know, like play Shostakovich, which I think is kind of superhuman. But yeah, that's a good description of the beginning of the book. Thanks. Did anybody else have like one more question, or we're... Yes.
For the book, like you said, you play cello, right?
Yeah.
And then like a character in the book like was hurt the hand.
Yeah.
Is that like a real life example, like, or like it's an experience from you? Like did you hurt your hand also, or like?
No, because that was like everybody's greatest fear, you know? Like, I think I like wanted to play a sport or something, and my cello teacher was like, no, like you can't do that. And your hands were like the most important part of my body. Like I, before performances, had those like things that runners use that you would crack that warm your hands. We would do like athletic visualizations of like how the hands moved. Like if you hurt your hand, that could mean that you wouldn't play the same ever again, depending on how you hurt your hand, you know? So I put that in the book because it's like the most dramatic thing that could happen. I don't actually know personally anybody that's happened to, because you have to be so drunk or cavalier to do that you don't care about anything, which is kind of where these characters are at. So, yeah. Thank you for having me. I'll be around to sign.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you. So now this brings us to the open mic portion of the evening. So if there's anyone that would like to read one of their own pieces or someone else's, come on up. Please share.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Hello, I'm Yanlin. I'll be reading a poem. So I'm just gonna get on. Okay. This is a poem called The Best Day to Take a Photograph. The best day to take a photograph is the day after it rains. When it smells of petrichor, the world is in its best clothes. Wedding gowns and suits of ink. It's a perfect day for a wedding. Dip heels into dectal. Agitate for a minute and 29 seconds. Throw the bouquet in the aperture for f-stop 22. Let it be brighter than the future until it's almost invisible. The noise is too loud. Quiet down, down they go, with 2 fingers and a thumb. Grains are annoying because they're small. Small things are so loud. Talk, babies, harmony, hearts. The groom looks like a broom. Wiry hair glued onto a balding scalp, covering up maps that lead to nowhere. His smile is watery, like the lake next to the dock she's sitting on, patiently waiting. Wading ducks, sipping salt. Splash, ambient light, whites get caught on fishing hooks. Splash, afocal projection. Focus on the lungs filling up, then letting go of air. Swimming is fun. The silk balances on a blue haze, and bubbles rise to the top. A baby giggles. The best day to take a photograph is the day after it rains. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aja. Thank you, Kim. Thank you to the student readers. Thank you, everybody, for coming out, supporting the storytellers. One more. Fantastic. So I understand there are books for sale, and feel free to linger and chat and enjoy. Thanks, everybody.